The young son of a woman named Yvonne Johnson was playing behind their Brookhaven Trailer Park house on Hurst Street in Opelika, Alabama on the afternoon of January 28, 2012 when he discovered a small human skull. Startled, the little boy ran inside to inform his mother, who then dialed 911. In a short period of time, authorities reached the location and retrieved the skull. They then spread out into the woods and discovered more human remains. Also, a pink long-sleeved shirt with heart buttons and ruffles was found. This was discovered next to a brook, but it was unclear to the investigators whether it was associated with the human remains. Following forensic examination, it was discovered that the bones belonged to an African-American girl between the ages of 4 and 7. In line with malnutrition, the results also showed that the young girl's bones were underdeveloped. She had an obvious abnormality to her left eye, which was presumably brought on by abuse, and there were indications that she had been physically assaulted before her death. The young girl suffered fractures to her ribs, shoulders, limbs, legs, and skull. She suffered more than 15 separate fractures from blunt force trauma in total. All these injuries had been incurred before she passed away. The girl's DNA was run through the missing person database, but no matches were found. The police soon appealed to the public for information. Unfortunately, there were very few tips, and after just 4 months, the case was closed. The unnamed youngster was later referred to as Opelika Jane Doe or Juvenile Jane Doe. In an effort to get some urgently needed information, federal agents at the FBI office in Quantico, Virginia, used forensic imaging equipment to create a sketch of what the young girl may have looked like while still alive. The composite sketch was made public by the detectives. They had billboards up around the southeast and circulated the flyers widely online, urging anyone who may identify the young child to get in touch immediately. Investigators soon determined that Opelika Jane Doe had died between 2010 and 2012. However, after a former vacation Bible school instructor at the Greater Peace Church in Opelika came across the sketch, she gave investigators a picture from 2011. She thought that Opelika Jane Doe was in the photos. They made public the church photos, which showed the young child with a defect in her left eye. She had black hair that was fashioned in little tight curls and was medium in length. The general population was prompted to reflect on the past and to examine whether they knew a little girl who attended the Bible school. According to them, Opelika Jane Doe usually appeared to have been slightly unkempt and wearing filthy clothes. She was described by the teacher as being quiet, solitary, and not particularly social with the other kids at the Bible school. Authorities tried to find her name in churches and schools, but they found nothing. They soon transferred Opelika Jane Doe's remains to the University of South Florida's Forensic Anthropology for isotope analyses after the images were made public. She was identified as being from the southeastern region of the country, most likely Alabama or nearby states. With no lead, the case went cold for 10 years. In 2022, detectives expanded their search for answers outside Alabama. They went to other states where the girl might have lived before her murder. They questioned residents and interviewed quite a number of people, showing them Opelika Jane Doe's possible photos to see if they could identify her. Luckily, there was a significant breakthrough in the investigation when authorities discovered 50-year-old Lamar Vickerstaff Jr. to be Opelika Jane Doe's father. Lamar Vickerstaff was born and raised in Opelika, but throughout his time in the Navy, he resided in a number of locations. He finally settled at Naval Station Mayport in Jacksonville. When investigators met with him at the naval installation to break the news of his daughter's death, he steadfastly refused to identify his daughter. His wife, Ruth Vickerstaff, was questioned by investigators, and she admitted she had no idea who his daughter was or who she might have been. She and Vickerstaff had tied the knot in 2006. The detectives did further investigation and discovered Opelika Jane Doe's real mother, who is 37-year-old Sherry Wiggins. Sherry disclosed to the police that in January 2006, she had given birth to a girl who went by the name of Amore Jovia Wiggins. However, after her visitation privileges were revoked, her ex-husband Vickerstaff and his wife were granted physical and legal custody of her daughter in 2009. Sherry Wiggins was able to provide investigators evidence that she had been paying Vickerstaff child support since 2009. According to investigators who looked through pediatric and school records in the communities where the Vickerstaffs resided, Amore Wiggins was never enrolled in school and was never reported missing. In January 2023, DNA testing made it clear that Opelika Jane Doe was actually Amore Jova Wiggins. On January 17th, Vickerstaff Lamar and his wife Ruth were both taken into custody. Ruth was charged with failing to report a missing child, while Vickerstaff was charged with felony murder and failure to report a missing child. Finally, after 11 years, Amore Wiggins' identity was finally buried with her. On February 27, 2023, hundreds of residents of Opelika and investigators came to honor her life. Detective Alfred White of the Opelika Police Department remarked, "We can finally put the right name and right face to her, and we don't have to call her Jane Doe anymore." Sherry, Amore's mother, was also present. In her words, she heartbreakingly said to her late daughter, "I didn't want you to have it hard, so I let your tiny hand go, thinking you'd be playing in a big backyard." Robert Hansen was born in Estreville, Iowa in 1939. He was the son of a Danish immigrant and followed in his father's footsteps as a baker. He was often ridiculed and bullied by his peers. He was very shy, smaller than his fellow classmates, suffered from a stutter, and had severe acne that left him permanently scarred. He was described as being quiet and a loner and had a strange relationship with his domineering father. Since he didn't receive attention he wanted from the girls in school, he grew up hating females and longed for revenge. He had no close friends in school, and when he graduated high school in 1957, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Reserve. He received advanced training as a military police officer at Fort Knox, where he became a skilled marksman. However, he was discharged after only serving 1 year. While enlisted in the Army, he was known to frequent prostitutes in the area, but he told fellow soldiers he found them dissatisfying and yearned to take more control of the situation. He later worked as an assistant drill instructor at a police academy in Pocahontas, Iowa. There, he began a relationship with a younger woman and the two would marry in 1960. On December 7, 1960, he was arrested for burning down the school bus garage of his local high school, revenge for his unpopularity in school. A friend turned him in, but he would serve less than 2 years in prison. While in prison, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder with periodic schizophrenic episodes. The psychiatrist also noted that Hansen had an infantile personality and was obsessed with getting back at people he felt had wronged him. While incarcerated, his wife would file for divorce. Over the next few years, he was jailed several times for petty theft and would marry once again, this time to Darla Hendrickson, and they would have 2 children. Darla was a deeply religious woman who had earned a master's degree in education and tutored children for income. She later said she knew Hansen was up to no good, but she just thought his dirty secret was picking up prostitutes in the middle of the night before going to work. In 1967, the family moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he would become very well liked by his neighbors and set several local hunting records. Darla and the children would regularly go to Arkansas during the summer each year, leaving Hansen behind. In 1971, he was arrested for abducting and attempting to rape a woman, and then for sexually assaulting a sex worker. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but after only serving 6 months, he was placed on a work release program and released to a halfway house. In 1976, he was caught stealing a chainsaw from an Anchorage Fred Meyer store. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and required to receive psychiatric treatment for his bipolar disorder and was released after only 1 year. In the early 1980s, he reported a burglary on his home which he had actually staged. With the money he got from the insurance company, he opened up a bakery of his own and established himself as a well-liked family man. In January 1982, he bought himself a Piper Super Club bush plane and would regularly fly it even though he had been denied a license due to his medication. He gained the nickname Butcher Baker for abducting and hunting down women in the wilderness just north of Anchorage through the early 1980s, when the state's largest city was booming because of construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Over time, he would become more selective of his victims, eventually learning that targeting sex workers and exotic dancers were less likely to get him caught because they were less likely to be believed by the authorities if they reported being raped or attacked. Many of the women were transients who came up to Alaska or runaways, and sometimes they were linked to organized crime and their families were unaware of where they were. His MO was to pick up sex workers or exotic dancers in his car and force them at gunpoint to his bush plane, where he would fly them to his shack in the Nick River area of the Matanuska Valley. He would then sexually assault them and then release them into the wilderness to hunt and kill them as if they were wild game. In 1983, he offered 17-year-old Cindy Paulson $200 to perform a sexual act, but when she got into the car, he pulled a gun on her and drove her to his home in Anchorage. His wife and children were vacationing in Europe at the time, and he had the house all to himself. While handcuffed to a post in his basement, he raped and tortured her. Afterward, he drove her to the Merrill Field Airport and told her he planned to take her out to his cabin. While Cindy was crouched in the back seat of the car with her wrist cuffed in front of her body, she saw a chance to escape when he was busy loading the airplane. While his back was turned, she crawled out of the back seat, opened the driver's side door, and ran toward the nearby Fifth Avenue. She later told police that she had left her blue sneakers on the passenger side floor of the sedan's back seat as evidence that she had been in the car. Hansen panicked and chased her, but she made it to Fifth Avenue first and managed to flag down a passing truck. The driver of the truck was alarmed by Cindy's appearance, stopped and picked her up, and then drove her to the Mush Inn, where she jumped out of the truck and ran inside. She then begged the clerk to call someone for her, which turned out to be her pimp. The truck driver then left and called the police to report the incident. When police officers arrived at the Mush Inn, they were told that the girl had taken a cab to the Big Timber Motel. When officers arrived at that motel, they found Cindy in room 110, still handcuffed and alone. She was then taken to the police station, where she described the perpetrator. Cindy made a formal statement to the police and not only identified the make and color of the plane, but also remembered its tail number. However, she was initially not taken seriously by cops because she was a young sex worker and they were considered untrustworthy. Still, the house she described was quickly identified as belonging to Hansen. When questioned by police, Hansen was outraged and insisted she was lying to extort money from him. He also questioned whether it was even possible to rape a prostitute. He claimed he had an alibi and told investigators his wife and children were in Europe and he spent the night playing poker with friends. When questioned, the two men from the alleged poker game substantiated his story. Hansen allowed authorities to search his home, but they didn't find evidence of what the victim described. She also refused to take a polygraph, and this made the police wonder if she fabricated the story. It was a he said, she said case because they had no evidence. Citing a lack of evidence, the prosecutor dropped the case. Meanwhile, Alaska state troopers had been investigating several bodies that had been found in and around Anchorage, Seward, and the Matsu Valley area. The first of the bodies was found by construction workers near Eklutna Road and was dubbed Eklutna Annie by investigators, and to this day has never been identified. Later that year, the body of Joanna Messina was found in a gravel pit near Seward, and in 1982, the remains of 23-year-old Sherry Morrow were discovered in a shallow grave near the Nick River. Police had 3 bodies and what looked like one killer. The FBI would create a criminal psychological profile based on the 3 recovered bodies. The FBI profiler described the killer as having low self-esteem, a history of rejection by women, and being an experienced hunter. He also correctly predicted that he would take souvenirs from his victims and would have a stutter. Using this profile, the lead detective investigated possible suspects, and this would eventually lead him to Hansen, who fit the profile and owned a plane. The 2 men who gave Hansen an alibi for the night he attacked Sandy Paulson confessed that they had been lying. Both friends said they were covering for him because they thought he was a legitimate guy, and they believed him when he said he thought the dancers were trying to extort him. Police obtained a warrant to search his plane, vehicles, and home. On October 27, 1983, investigators uncovered jewelry belonging to some of the missing women, as well as an array of firearms in a corner hideaway of his attic. Also found was an aeronautical chart with 37 little X marks on it hidden behind Hansen's headboard. Many of these marks matched sites where prior bodies had been found. When confronted with the evidence found in his home, he denied it as long as he could, but he eventually began to blame the women and tried to justify his actions. He would eventually start confessing to each item of evidence as it was presented to him, and admitted to a spree of attacks against Alaskan women starting in 1971. Hansen's earliest victims were young women, usually between 16 and 19, and not prostitutes, unlike the victims who led to his discovery. When an FBI forensic lab matched the shell casings found near the victims to the many 14 found in Hansen's house, he made a plea bargain. At this time, only Sherry Morrow, Joanna Messina, Paula Golding, and Jane Doe of Klutna Annie's remains were found, and he would be charged for each of their murders. He also confessed to the abduction and rape of Cindy Paulson. He then agreed to confess to all of the crimes, give details about each of his victims, and show the burial sites marked on his map in exchange for serving his sentence in a federal prison and avoiding media publicity. Another condition of the plea bargain required him to decipher the markings on his aviation map and help locate his victims' bodies. During questioning, Hansen claimed that starting in 1973, after finishing his rape sentence, he became a serial rapist, picking up prostitutes in Anchorage and taking them to the wilderness in his bush plane where he would rape and torture them. He later claimed that the ones who complied would be returned to Anchorage alive and those who didn't, he would kill. From 1973 to 1983, he abducted and raped at least 30 women with that method and then let them go. However, at least 17 women picked up during the years of 1980 to 1983 were less fortunate. He showed the police 17 of his burial sites, but there were more than 17 marks on his map, suggesting he had more victims than he admitted to, but he refused to help them with the others. It has been theorized that he wouldn't confess to killing them because they were neither prostitutes nor strippers, and he couldn't justify their murders to himself. The victims that were found were exhumed and returned to their families. Hansen was sentenced by jury to 461 years plus life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he would die on August 21, 2014 at the age of 75 from natural causes. In August 2014, one of his young unidentified victims, known as Horseshoe Harriet, was exhumed and a DNA sample was taken and uploaded into Cody's, but no matches were found. In August 2021, her DNA profile was uploaded into a public genetic genealogy database. She became known as Horseshoe Harriet when her remains were found in 1984 by Horseshoe Lake near Anchorage, after getting several close matches of a few potential relatives that currently live in Alaska and Arkansas. A family tree for the victim was constructed. Genealogy research indicated that the victim might be a woman named Robin Pelkey, and then DNA analysis completed by Peribon Nanolabs in September 2021 would confirm this. Robin was 19 years old and living on the streets of Anchorage when she was killed by Hansen in the early 1980s. Robin was born in 1963 in Colorado, and records indicate that she had been living in Anchorage in the early 1980s when Hansen was active. Sadly, she was never reported as missing. The following are 16 more women that are probable murder victims of Hansen. Celia Bath Van Zanten was a 17-year-old who was abducted and killed on December 22, 1971, while walking from her house to a local convenience store. Her body was found by hikers 3 days later on Christmas Day. She was still alive when she was either thrown or fell into a ravine. She apparently tried to climb out, but with her hands tied behind her back, she had no way to pull herself up the cliff, and she repeatedly fell until she froze to death in the frigid December weather. Investigators discovered tire tracks turning lazy circles in the parking lot of the campground, and they believed Beth escaped her attacker, ran down the steep slope, and probably fell into the ravine. Her abductors circled the parking lot, waiting for her to reappear, but when she never did, he finally left. Soon after her murder, 18-year-old Sandra Patterson, the daughter of an Alaska state trooper, came forward to report her abduction on December 19th. Sandra worked as a prostitute to support her heroin addiction. She was working in the parking lot of the Nevada Club in Anchorage when a man pointed a gun at her and told her he would kill her if she didn't do what he wanted. She described her attacker as a slender man in his mid-20s wearing horn-rimmed glasses. The man drove Sandra to a motel on the Canoe Peninsula nearly 100 miles south of Anchorage and raped her. On the drive back to Anchorage, he threatened to kill her if she reported him to the police. Sandra complied with his demands to remain silent until she heard about Beth's murder, and then she knew she had to come forward and tell authorities about her abduction. Police asked Sandra to study a book of photos of non-sex offenders to see if she could pick out the man who had kidnapped and raped her. She immediately identified her attacker as Robert Hansen. Hansen's photo was in the book because he was awaiting trial for the attempted kidnapping of a young Anchorage woman. Hansen was initially charged with kidnapping and raping Sandra Patterson, but prosecutors considered her an unreliable witness, and the charges were eventually dropped. Meanwhile, nothing tied Hansen to the murder and abduction of Beth other than an X on his aviation map. Megan Shaban-Emmerich was also a 17-year-old who was last seen in Seward, Alaska on July 7, 1973. She was a student at the Seward Skills Center, now called the Alaska Vocational Technical Center, and was last seen walking out of a dormitory laundry room. Hansen admitted he was in Seward the day Megan disappeared, but he denied any involvement in her case. Her body has never been found, and it is believed he did not admit to her murder, because she was not a prostitute or exotic dancer, but instead was a college student and he could not justify her murder to himself. Mary Kathleen Teal is a 22-year-old who was last seen on July 5, 1975. Her husband was away working on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and she asked a friend to give her a ride into town and was dropped off at the bakery. Another friend saw her at the waterfall on Lowell Point Road between 1:30 and 2 o'clock p.m. She has never been heard from again. Hansen denied killing her, but he is suspected to have abducted and killed her. Joanna Messina is a 24-year-old who went missing on May 19, 1980. Her decomposed body was found 2 months later in a gravel pit near Caney Lake, just south of Moose Pass. A dental assistant by training, she was broke and alone when Hansen tried to pick her up on the sewer dock. Hansen didn't initially have any nefarious intentions with her and instead actually wanted to go on a normal date, which she agreed to. However, Joanna couldn't stay in town because she had a cannery job call the following day and needed to get back to her campsite. When she asked Hansen for money, things quickly went south because in his mind, that made her a prostitute. So he killed Joanna, hastily buried her in a gravel pit, and then he killed her dog. Roxanne Eastland is a 24-year-old who went missing on June 28, 1980. She had been staying for the past 2 weeks with her boyfriend at the Budget Motel on Spenard Road in Anchorage, Alaska, and was supposed to meet with an unidentified male on 4th Avenue downtown that day. Hansen confessed to killing her, but her body has never been found. Lisa Futrell is a 41-year-old who was last seen on September 6, 1980. Her body was found in May of 1984, south of Old Nick Bridge after Hansen told authorities where they could find her. Sadly, there is no additional information in her case. Sherry Morrow is a 23-year-old who was an exotic dancer in a seedy area of Anchorage known as 4th Avenue. The location of our next case is Santa Rosa in California's Sonoma County, a city well known for its wineries. Firstly, before we discuss the events that took place there, let us travel to Bellingham, a city in San Mateo County, California. Noelle Russo was born in the 1940s and raised in San Mateo County, California, though not much is known about her family. At 16, she won the title of Miss Bellingham in a beauty pageant in 1962, which attracted local attention and made headlines. She stated in an interview for an article that she wanted to be a model and that her favorite sport was twist dancing. Russo's radiant smile was captured in an accompanying photograph showing her clutching a bouquet of flowers. Russo's life saw a lot of changes during the next 20 years, including 2 marriages and 2 divorces, as well as the birth of a son. She had briefly left her Bay Area residence to pursue a career as a trainee forest ranger in Colorado. She eventually made her way back to the Bay Area and enrolled in Santa Rosa Junior College there. Russo liked to ride her bike around town, but friends who knew her back then said that she also had a habit of hitchhiking, which alarmed her friends because they thought she might put too much trust in random people. After a fight with a boyfriend on Friday, June 24, 1983, Russo, who was 37 years old at the time, went to stay with a friend in Santa Rosa. It is unknown what sparked their argument or who this boyfriend was. Russo's friend offered to drive her to Courthouse Square that evening so she could take a Golden Gate Transit bus back to her Rohnert Park apartment. Unfortunately, Russo disappeared without a trace after that. A disturbing discovery was made on Monday, June 27, 1983. In Rohnert Park, close to Sonoma State University, a 7-year-old boy discovered Russo's lifeless body behind a real estate office at the intersection of Petaluma Hill Road and East Cotide Avenue. She was discovered nude. Sonoma County Sheriff's Office deputies arrived on the scene quickly and launched an investigation. It was concluded that Russo had died a horrible death after being struck to death by a piece of lumber from a nearby stack of wood. Investigators from the Violent Crime Investigations Unit began a thorough investigation into Russo's tragic circumstance. According to their initial assessment, Russo most likely never took the bus back to Rohnert Park, meaning that she probably met someone before the bus arrived. During the course of this investigation, cops and detectives collected a significant amount of evidence and spoke with numerous people. Investigators hired a sketch artist in the days that followed the tragic event to help them create a drawing of Russo wearing the clothing she had on June 24, 1983. In an attempt to generate leads, they distributed it to the general public. While some people were named as persons of interest in the case by detectives over the years, no arrests were made. Sadly, Russo's killer's trail dried up, leaving her horrific murder unsolved. The committed detective from the Violent Crime Investigations Unit kept following leads in the case as the years went by. Between 2010 and 2023, law enforcement officials sent multiple pieces of evidence for DNA analysis to the Santa Clara County Crime Lab and the Serological Research Institute. By 2023, investigators were able to positively identify a suspect, which was the result of their persistent efforts. It turned out to be Alfredo Carotero Jr., a 65-year-old man. But authorities never disclosed the precise type of evidence that supported Carotero's involvement in this protractedly unresolved case. Authorities also provided a limited amount of Carotero-related information. He had previously been found guilty in Sonoma County of possession of stolen property and drug possession in 1995 and 2001, respectively. Investigators obtained a warrant for Carotero's arrest in relation to Russo's death. They were able to successfully capture him on October 2, 2023. After that, he was charged with murder and taken into the Sonoma County Main Adult Detention Facility. He is currently being held without the possibility of posting bail. Russo's family was notified of the arrest and asked to remain anonymous during this trying time. Officers from the Seaside Police Department arrived at Sabato Park in Seaside, California on January 3, 1991. What they discovered was unsettling. It was 34-year-old Vicki Johnson's lifeless body found on a sandy playground. The scene was absolutely horrifying, and Vicki Johnson's body was severely injured. The investigations got underway immediately, but they had no idea that the case would stay unsolved for many years. Famous for its breathtaking white sand beaches and charming architecture, Seaside, California is a picturesque coastal town. It is a medium-sized community with more than 32,000 inhabitants. Numerous academic institutions, including the Monterey College of Law and California State University Monterey Bay, are located in this charming town. But even in a place as peaceful as Seaside, crimes can occur anywhere, as evidenced by the horrible case of Vicki Johnson. Vicki Renee Johnson was born on February 19, 1956, in Kern County, California, to Virginia Ruth Jackson and Tommy Jackson. She was the middle child of their 3 children. She was raised with her younger brother, Mark Anthony Johnson, and her older sister, Valeria Alberta Johnson. Vicki lived a quiet, unassuming life away from the spotlight, where her personal details were not well documented or known. The rest of her life is still unknown. Despite the scant information that is known about her life, Vicki Johnson was the mother of 3 sons, Orlando Vincent Johnson, Robbie Johnson, and Jamal Damon Johnson. Remarkably, Orlando would go on to become well known as an NBA player in the future. But when Orlando was barely a year old in 1991, tragedy struck the family and sadly, Vicki's life took a tragic turn. Vicki's body was found in the early hours of January 3, 1991 by the Seaside Police Department. In addition to having bite marks all over her and evidence of strangulation, her dead body had also been set on fire by the attacker. Vicki's body was found in Sabato Park, a disturbing scene, but no witnesses were there to offer any information about what had happened. It appeared as though the park had been abandoned at the tragic moment, giving detectives a difficult case to solve. After being called to the scene, the forensic team gathered any evidence that would help identify the offender. However, it was difficult to find important clues due to Vicky's burned body. In a desperate attempt, they sent Vicky's fingernail clippings to the lab for analysis in the hopes that they would lead to a breakthrough. Their quest for solutions would not be simple, though. Vicky's family found themselves in a position of powerlessness, clinging to nothing more than their hope for justice, as the case lacked clear answers and the era's limited technology made it challenging to identify the offender. Orlando's grandmother from Virginia took care of him as he was just a baby boy, when his mother suffered a tragic accident. Although he was raised in his grandparents' arms, the pain of losing his mother at such a young age would always be remembered in his heart. Between 1989 and 1995, the Johnson family experienced a terrible string of events that resulted in the deaths of 7 members of their close-knit family. During this tragic sequence, Orlando lost his grandmother, who had served as his primary caregiver, to a heart attack. Orlando's 2 older brothers took on the role of caregiver as the family situation became more challenging. The pursuit of justice for his mother seemed to go on forever as Orlando dealt with his own problems. Every attempt by the investigators to discover the truth ended in failure despite their relentless efforts. The terrifying possibility that this horrible deed might have been committed by a serial killer lingered with the police. Seaside had a history of high-profile crimes at the time of Vicky's murder. There were always new cases coming in for the local police department, as well as old ones that had been unsolved for years. Nick Borges, the chief of police in Seaside, said that the town was considered to be tough and was a home to a few extremely dangerous psychopaths. The town had already seen 10 murders in 1991 alone. Nevertheless, even in this difficult setting, Vicky Johnson's killings were especially startling. Chief Nick Borges noted that most other killings in Seaside involved shootings and were associated with gang activity. Vicky's case, however, was a horrifying deviation from this pattern. Her vicious assaults and the act of setting her ablaze elevated the violence in the neighborhood to a previously unheard-of level, alarming and upsetting the locals as well as law enforcement. But as time went on, Seaside started to experience improvements. Vicky's neighbor, Mark Valle, was adamant that Vicky was a victim of the unforgiving town environment. He believed that the time had come for Vicky and her family to get the answers and justice they so richly deserved. The case went cold despite extensive investigations and numerous attempts to find clues. Not a single lead materialized. There was no resolution to the case for more than 30 years. Orlando, Vicky's son, who went on to become a professional basketball player, kept his mother's memory alive and clung to the hope that justice would be served by sharing photos of her online. Then a glimmer of hope appeared, and at last the questions that had been bothering him were about to have an answer. Vicky's case was closed, for an astounding 32 years before the Seaside Police Department decided to reopen it and a few other unsolved cases. Vicky's case saw progress in 2023 out of all the cases that were reopened between 2021 and 2023. With the aid of the most recent DNA testing technology available, the evidence from the initial investigation was examined once more. Beneath Vicky's fingernail clippings, the State Department of Justice Crime Laboratory found a DNA match that identified a man as Frank Lewis McClure. Frank Lewis McClure had a problematic past that began in the 1990s. He was 46 years old when Vicky was killed. Having engaged in criminal activity on numerous occasions throughout his life, he was no stranger to the legal system. McClure was charged with several serious offenses in 1990 alone, including possession of equipment used for the manufacture, concealment, or use of illegal drugs. In addition, he was charged with resisting arrest, assault causing serious injury, assault using a deadly weapon, and domestic abuse. Frank Lewis McClure was arrested twice in 1991, putting him back on the wrong side of the law. One was for assault with a deadly weapon and the other was for domestic abuse. In 1994, McClure's legal problems worsened when he broke the terms of his felony probation, which led to a 4-year prison sentence. His record of being arrested for domestic abuse continued with 2 more arrests in 1999 and 2011. McClure's long and tumultuous history with the criminal justice system is evident. It is important to remember that, despite the seriousness of assault and domestic abuse cases, as Chief Nick Borgers has stated, McClure's prior cases all seem to have a personal element. The fact that Vicki Johnson had no known relationship to him before the DNA match, despite his past legal issues, added to the complexity and difficulty of her case. Frank Lewis McClure had a violent past, but according to Chief Nick Borgers, he and his family were well-liked and well-known in the neighborhood. His involvement in Vicki Johnson's murder was shocking in itself because no one who knew him would have imagined that he was capable of such a violent and heinous deed. Though Borgers acknowledged that the police and detectives of the time made every effort to obtain information, he concluded that the justice for murder victims was outweighed by the chilly silence that pervaded this small town. The declaration emphasized the difficulties law enforcement faces in a tight-knit community, where a culture of secrecy may obstruct investigations into heinous crimes like murder. Now, in 2023, with McClure's evidence verified, it appeared that an arrest was the last resort. But what happened turned out to be something that nobody could have predicted, especially the Johnson family, who had yearned for justice to be served. At the age of 77, Frank McClure had already passed away in 2021. Even though McClure died in his seaside home without receiving justice, the Johnson family and the devoted detectives, who had spent years and years working on the case, had some answers at last. They now know who had carried out this unbelievable deed, even though the reason for the crime remained a mystery. Orlando and his brothers were able to finally exhale with relief when they realized that the murderer was no longer hiding in the shadows, but had been exposed. What do you think about this case? Do you believe that, in the end, the Johnson family will be able to find peace? On Wednesday, October 4th, 1978, a sunny morning in Spokane, Washington, two construction workers were heading to work when they came upon something horrifying in the woods. In front of them lay the icy, lifeless body of a half-naked girl. The workers could tell she had endured some pretty severe torture, even at first glance. A sight so gory they were unable to look at her for very long. The 16-year-old victim, Chryson Baxter, was identified by the authorities upon their arrival at the crime scene after they were notified of the tragic discovery. Detectives started looking for Chryson's killer as word of her ruthless murder spread like wildfire throughout Spokane. How did Chryson get into the forest? Who could have harmed a 16-year-old so severely? Would the man in question ever be apprehended by the detectives? With a population of 229,000, Spokane is the biggest city in Washington, USA, and serves as the county seat of government. Situated in eastern Washington, next to the Kirk Mountains and the Spokane River, Spokane provides its residents with a picturesque view. Spokane is referred to by its nickname, Lilac City, by the locals, and is well known for being the origin of Father's Day. Spokane is home to two of Washington's largest state parks and the state's largest urban waterfall. Residents and visitors alike frequently enjoy a variety of outdoor activities in Spokane. Spokane's vibrant art and entertainment scenes, combined with the city's limitless outdoor experiences, foster a welcoming community. But this lovely city has a darker side as well. Spokane, Washington, has the third highest crime rate among major cities in Washington and is 59% higher than the national average. This neighborhood is safer than 2% of all U.S. neighborhoods. The likelihood of someone being the victim of a violent crime is 1 in 157. So, this brings us to 1978, the year of one of the most horrific crimes that occurred here. In Chehalis, Lewis County, Washington, USA, on May 21, 1962, Chryson Baxter was born to Ed and Charlie Baxter. She grew up in a fairly typical household with her older brother, Steve Baxter. Chryson later relocated to Spokane, Washington with her family. In 1978, Chryson was 16 years old and a student at Joseph Yunga High School. Similar to other teenagers, she was going through a phase of rebellion. As the older protective brother, Chrysan's brother, would always be by her side, even if she ended up fighting with her parents. Chryson fled her house on a Saturday on September 30th, 1978. Nevertheless, the reason Chryson left home that day was never discovered. All her mother could hope for was Krizan's safe return home. Krizan's mother reported her daughter missing to the Spokane Police Department that same day. Sadly, none of the efforts to find the 16-year-old schoolgirl were successful. Over the course of following few days, Spokane detectives interviewed Krizan's classmates and combed through the city streets for any clues that might lead them to Krizan. The sad ending of the Spokane Police Department search for Krizan came on Wednesday, October 4th, 1978, when two employees of an electric company called to report that a girl's body had been found. When Spokane County Sheriff's deputies and detectives arrived at the scene to start the investigation, their worst suspicions were confirmed when they discovered that the deceased girl was Chris and a half-mile north of Hawthorne Road between Division and Whitworth Drive, close to the Whitworth University campus. The detectives were informed by the electric company employees that they discovered Krizan's body in the shade of a pine grove while they were en route to work. Given the appalling condition Krizan's body was in, the investigators could tell exactly what she had been through. Krizan had been beaten and attacked before she was strangled to death. She was practically nude. Her bra was wrapped around her neck, and the only thing covering her body was a light blue pullover shirt that had been pulled up around her chest. The detectives informed Krizan's family of the news, and a little after 9 o'clock at night, Steve, Krizan's 23-year-old brother, verified the identity on October 4th, 1978. Just a few days had passed since Krizan's mother had filed a missing persons report, and her anguish only increased upon learning of her daughter's battered body. Sheriff's detectives Donald C. McCabe and James E. Hansen, who were assigned to work on the homicide, began their investigation while the 16-year-old's family was in mourning. The Pine Forest crime scene was thoroughly examined and recorded. The detectives processed the scene and gathered evidence, possibly including DNA samples, with some help from the forensics division. Later, this evidence was sent for additional analysis. After conducting an autopsy on Krizan's body shortly after her discovery, Spokane County Coroner Lois R. Shanks concluded that Krizan had been dead for approximately 2 days prior to her discovery, indicating that she had been murdered on October 2nd, 1978. The cause of Krizan's death was determined to be strangulation. The coroner also noted that she had severe liver and lung trauma in addition to having numerous bruises throughout her body. She had clearly been abused and assaulted severely before she was strangled by her own bra strap. The items removed from the crime scene, along with some extra biological evidence for analysis, were sent to the crime laboratory of the Washington State Patrol. Despite the belief that the samples sent to the lab contained DNA, the early stages and limits of DNA testing technology prevented a complete analysis. The evidence was preserved so that it could be tested later when DNA technology would be more advanced. A few days later, her family gathered at Greenwood Memorial Park in Centralia, Washington's Lewis County, for Krizan's funeral. Tears sparkled in everyone's eyes as they recalled and treasured the time Krizan spent with them. While Krizan's family was recovering from the tragedy, detectives in Spokane County worked long shifts searching for any hint that might lead them to her killer. According to detectives, their plan would be to trace Krizan's movements back to the day she ran away from home until her murder. They wanted to know where Krizan had been, if she had been seen by anyone, and if anyone was with her. The detective declared that they would exhaust every possibility in their investigation, despite the fact that they currently had no strong lead. Even with their preparation, the detective's search for the culprit was not going to be simple. It took a long time to interview each of Krizan's numerous friends one at a time. But what was unexpected was that not a single one of her friends had seen her since the day she fled. Furthermore, none of them seemed to know where she'd been before her murder. Every friend of Krizan that the detective spoke to gave them the names of 20 more people, but the detectives learned that Krizan had a boyfriend and thought that he could be a potential suspect in the case. However, that lead was also abandoned when it was discovered that Krizan's boyfriend was incarcerated at the time of her death. In mid-October 1978, a local lawyer approached the detectives, saying he had some information that could aid in their investigation. A few days prior to Krizan's murder, the lawyer claimed he had seen a couple standing beside a black four-wheel drive pickup that was parked near the spot where Krizan's body was eventually discovered. Because it was unusual for anyone to be in the area at that time of day, he remembered the car, and the whole situation just seemed a bit fishy. He went on to say that the girl was probably Chris and Baxter herself, and that he would know the man she was with right away. The investigators also looked into this tip in more detail. Still, it was a fruitless endeavor. At the same time that word had already spread widely about Chrisann's horrific murder, Henry Lee Lucas, a self-described serial killer, made claims that he killed Chrisann's. Given that Henry had confessed to killing roughly 100 women in 16 states, the detectives were compelled to look into this confession. After questioning him multiple times, his confessions were questionable and he was removed from the list of potential suspects. For a brief while, the detectives did think he was the culprit and even got a murder warrant for him. As time went on and there was no significant advancement in the investigation, the murderer had more chances to flee and hide. Detectives had more questions than answers as 1978 drew to a close. The case was one of the hardest ones the detectives had ever worked on, and they were frustrated. The case was unlikely to be solved anytime soon, adding it to the stack of unsolved cases after fruitless tips that produced no leads and no list of possible suspects. Over the course of the following few years, the detectives questioned an increasing number of people and followed up with every possible lead, but regrettably no noteworthy progress was ever made. The case became unresponsive and remained so for many years. Nearly 28 years after Chrisann was killed, in August 2006, Major Crimes Detective D. Mask reopened Chrisann's case. He re-examined the case, scrutinizing every last detail and looking into all of the previously gathered evidence. Recognizing that DNA technology had advanced significantly, he returned the samples to the crime laboratory of the Washington State Patrol for analysis. When forensic experts retested the evidence using upgraded technology, the findings revealed two distinct DNA profiles. These two profiles matched those of an unidentified male and Chrisann Baxter. In the hopes of finding a match, the male profile was submitted to the combined DNA index system, but no match was discovered for the following 8 years. Then, in 2014, the National DNA Indexing System received an update to the profile of the unidentified man. Even after the profile was rotated against each and every DNA entry in the country at National DNA Indexing System, no match was found. There were still no matches found after another 5 years. Since the unknown man's profile was added to the National DNA Indexing System, the case has remained unresolved for more than 40 years. However, in 2020, significant progress was made due to the rapid development of a method known as genetic genealogy. In 2020, samples from Chrisann's case were once more sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab by Major Crimes Detective M. Drapeau for further analysis. In early 2021, some of the forensic evidence was sent to Othram Laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas for advanced DNA testing. Scientists at Othram were able to create a detailed DNA profile for the unidentified male whose DNA was found at the crime scene by using a method known as forensic-grade genome sequencing. This made it possible for scientists at Othram to compare the DNA profile of this unidentified male with millions of other profiles that were already kept in numerous national databases. These new methods of investigation proved to be very beneficial. The Othram internal genealogy team was able to identify the suspect's possible relatives, even though they were unable to locate an exact match. This analysis revealed that the murderer was descended directly from a particular woman who had passed away. Othram gave these leads to M. Drapeau, a Spokane County Sheriff detective. Drapeau used the new information to launch a follow-up investigation, and detectives quickly found the identified relative surviving family members. These relatives were then contacted and interviewed as part of further investigative efforts to identify the unidentified male contributor. The family members cooperated with the inquiry and did not hesitate to provide their DNA samples for additional testing. With all of the detectives' and scientists' hard work and efforts, the DNA profile of the unidentified male was eventually given a name by Othram scientists after they examined the reference samples from these family members. Keith D. Lindblom was identified as the male contributor who was not identified. After identifying a likely familiar DNA match, the Othram genealogists were able to track down Lindblom's daughter, who was living in Louisiana. When the detectives contacted her, she consented to give a sample of her DNA. The sample matched after being examined by forensic experts. When the daughter's DNA sample was compared to Lindblom's DNA sample, which was taken in 1978, the likelihood of a match to Lindblom and his known child was 320 times higher than if the sample had been compared to an unrelated person. A method known as KINSNPE, which enabled researchers to infer kinship and closely and distantly related individuals, was used at Othram in order to precisely confirm this relation. This relationship testing method, which was based on 45 segments in total, had a 100% match confidence level and verified Lindblom and the daughter's parent-child relationship. This proved that the male DNA found on Chrisan's 1978 body did in fact belong to Keith D. Lindblom. But Lindblom would never confess to the police. Lindblom was born on March 31, 1949 and died in 1981 at the age of 32, just 3 years after killing Chrisan. This indicated that Lindblom killed Chrisan when he was 29. Detectives were unaware that Chrisan's murderer had already passed away. On April 11, 1981, Lindblom was caught in a fire and passed away that same day. To verify the accuracy of this information, the detectives even examined his death certificate, which indicated that he died in an accident. The Spokane County Sheriff's Office declared in public that they had used genetic genealogy to solve Chrisan's case in mid-September of 2023. They also stated that because the suspect had already passed away, the case was officially closed on September 8, 2023. Following a consultation between Detective Drapeau and the Spokane County prosecutor, it was determined that charges against Lindblom would have been appropriate had he survived. Scientists were unable to locate a DNA match because Lindblom passed away years before law enforcement began entering DNA profiles into the databases. Investigators dug deeper into Lindblom's background to learn more about him and discovered some disturbing facts. After searching through law enforcement database archives, detectives discovered Lindblom's violent past. Lindblom was detained and charged in Spokane County in June 1975 for allegedly forcing himself on a 16-year-old girl and assaulting her. This horrific deed also happened close to the location where Chrisan's corpse was found in 1978. The other charges were dropped when 26-year-old Lindblom admitted to having sexual relations with a minor under duress in August 1975 and entered a plea of guilty to first-degree assault. Lindblom insisted on his innocence and that he only entered a guilty plea to the assault charges in order to avoid a trial when he was questioned by anyone. Investigators discovered that Lindblom was not in custody. When Chrisan Baxter was murdered and assaulted because he had been released from prison on August 7, 1978, just 2 months prior to Chrisan's murder, the case of 16-year-old Chrisan Baxter had the detectives on edge for 45 years. But now that her murderer has been found and the long-standing mystery has been resolved, they can finally go to sleep. Unfortunately, though, Steve Baxter, Chrisan's older brother, passed away in Seattle, Washington on January 1, 2023, before the murder of his younger sister was solved. The Spokane County Sheriff's Department released a statement expressing gratitude to Lindblom's family members for their willing cooperation throughout the investigation, as well as to all of the investigators who worked on Chrisan's case. The victim, Chris on Baxter's family, was deeply appreciated by the department for their cooperation and patience during this protracted and challenging search for her killer. Investigators with the Spokane County Sheriff's Office hope that this provides some closure to Chrisan's family and friends, and a small amount of comfort knowing that the suspect was finally identified even though Lindblom is long gone and will not face any criminal charges. Mildred Matheny disappeared on Saturday, April 27, 1985, when someone saw her naked and immobile body on the dirt road at Jupiter's intersection of Old Indian Town Road and 125th Avenue North. They immediately contacted the police. On April 7, 1985, Mildred Matheny, a 78-year-old Alzheimer's patient, went out of her Lake Worth Beach, Florida home and got into a stranger's car. Unfortunately, she died as a result of this innocent outing. She was discovered later that day, 30 miles from her house, bruised and naked on an unpaved dirt road. 11 days after her injuries, she passed away. The killer and assailant of Mildred remained unidentified for almost 40 years until a breakthrough resulted in a conviction in 2023. Lake Worth Beach is a charming city in Florida's east central Palm Beach County. The Lake Worth Lagoon is the source of its name. Situated just 64 miles north of lively, Miami, the town has a population of about 42,000. This coastal haven is located east of Palm Springs, north of Lantana, southeast of Lake Clark Shores, and south of West Palm Beach. Lake Worth Beach is a unique hub of culture and creativity within the vast Miami metropolitan area. Vibrant visual arts, experimental music, dance, and theater flourish here. The familiarity of neighbors knowing one another by name is the foundation of the community. The streets are secure, much like a place where open doors indicate trust. But even in the midst of such a pleasant environment, a tragedy struck in 1985, leaving a scar in the otherwise tranquil neighborhood. On February 28, 1907, Mildred Matheny was born in Wilmar, Arkansas. Despite being the second of Jess and Margaret Warren's 6 cherished children, tragedy shaped her early years. At the age of 37, Mildred's father passed away from a heart attack when she was just 8 years old. This left widow Margaret, who was devastated, to raise their 6 tiny children by herself. As Mildred approached adulthood, she started a career that would shape much of her life. Her compassion and kindness affected countless lives during her more than 40 years of committed work in the field of psychiatric nursing. When she married Guy Harmon Matheny in her early years, the couple welcomed a precious son named Gary into their family. But life also brought its fair share of heartaches. Mildred's husband passed away in 1958, leaving her a 51-year-old widow. Mildred put in nearly 40 years of unwavering dedication as a psychiatric nurse in a Little Rock mental health facility to make a living. Afterwards, following her husband's passing, Mildred relocated to Palm Beach County, Florida, from her birthplace of Arkansas, seeking solace in the city's welcoming embrace. Mildred's 75-year-old sister Gladys Nolan offered her a home and companionship after she had persevered through difficult times in life. In Lake Worth Beach, their residence was situated on the 1300 block of Crestwood Boulevard. A life of service had characterized Mildred's journey. She not only took care of her brother as his mental state deteriorated, but also dealt with her own health problems as she got closer to 70. She started a new chapter in her life at her sister's home as a result of her illness. The allure of Florida's stunning coasts drew her in, and her son and grandchildren encouraged her to make the courageous decision to move. The adjustment was not without its challenges, though. Her judgment was clouded by dementia and the transfer, which placed her in unfamiliar terrain. She was afraid to go outside without a reliable companion. When she and Gladys settled into their new Floridian home, she was excited and full of hope for a visit from her cherished grandchildren. On April 27, 1985, Mildred Matheny, a dementia patient, disappeared from the tranquil enclave of her Florida home at approximately 4:30 p.m. Witnesses claimed to have seen her at approximately 3:30 p.m. as she stepped out of her house wearing a shirt over pajamas, totally unaware of the impending catastrophe. An excruciating hour later, the alarm went off and she was officially reported missing. 7 hours after going missing, she was found unconscious, nude and hurt on a remote dirt road by a bystander, about 20 miles from her last known location. After the bystander informed the police of his discovery, an investigation was sparked right away. Mildred's ordeal was evident on the dirt road, which was now contaminated by her blood-stained dentures and abandoned clothes. Her blood-stained dentures were discovered on the road and her clothes were all over the place. She had a severe head injury, so they rushed her to Juniper Medical Center, where she was examined by a brain surgeon. The woman appeared to have been struck quite hard because of the heavy bleeding from her head and face. No one saw her being kidnapped, but her neighbors claimed to have seen her walking down the street in her pajamas at around 3:30 p.m. Mildred's injuries, especially the severe blow to her head, caused her to pass away 11 days later. The fact that she had been so viciously attacked broke people's heart. The assault test was carried out by hospital nurses because the way she had been hurt was so horrifying. Everything came together for the detectives to piece together. They collected swabs from the crime scene that contained a combination of the attackers and Mildred Matheny's DNA. However, due to the outdated technology at the time, no hits were discovered and the case was abandoned. For almost 40 years, no one knew who had killed and injured Mildred. All the police had was some DNA that the assailant had left behind, but it was too old for scientists to determine its source. Authorities claimed that the Cold Case Homicide Unit had played a key role in this case's resolution for years. This detective squad focuses on cold case investigations. They used enhanced and novel DNA analysis methods to connect the assault evidence to the attacker. In 2021, the foreign DNA was isolated from Mildred's by a scientist who examined evidence from the Palm Beach County Police Station, where this incident took place. They used this DNA to build a profile, which they then submitted into the Florida State Combined DNA Index System. DNA from the assault kit was soon connected to a man named Richard Curtis Lang. According to records, when he had hurt Mildred, he had been 25 years old. However, detectives needed to get a direct sample of his DNA to be sure. This required obtaining a saliva sample from Richard Curtis Lang in order to confirm that it matched the foreign DNA found on the victim. They got a warrant or special permission to do this. Detectives went to Richard Lang's house in Boynton Beach, Florida on April 22, 2021, and took a sample of his DNA. According to records, Richard Lang, who is currently 62 years old, had been in serious trouble in 2006 and 2012, which made him provide his DNA. This was how his DNA entered the database. Thanks to sophisticated detective work and advanced technology, the identity of Mildred Matheny's killer has finally been determined after all these years. Records kept by the state and county indicate that Richard Lang had a history of legal issues. He was found guilty of aggravated assault in both 1983 and 1993. But instead of serving time in prison, he received a probationary sentence. But he didn't stop there. He was discovered with weapons in 2006 and 2012. He did not spend much time in prison for these offenses, even though they were serious ones. He did not spend a significant amount of time in prison because he received short sentences. Richard Curtis Lang was detained and accused of killing Mildred Matheny. In April 2021, the trial got underway in early 2023 and Richard Lang was charged with Mildred Matheny's assault and murder. A significant trial in a West Palm Beach courtroom revolved around a tiny piece of genetic material. The sperm from Mildred's assault kit had a direct connection to Richard Lang. The scientist who discovered the match testified in court during the trial. Although they were unable to confirm that the DNA they found originated from Lang, they asserted that the likelihood of it coming from him was 27 quadrillion times greater than that of it coming from someone else. Scott Skier, Richard Lang's attorney, argued that the DNA might also have come from Lang's close male cousins. Nevertheless, investigators did not run any DNA matching tests on any of them. After classifying Richard Lang as a suspect, Assistant State Attorneys Joe Wilensky and Krish Mixon disagreed with this argument, reminding the jurors that no other family member was in Florida in 1985. They referred to it as speculative. In his 20s, Richard Lang left Massachusetts to work as a plumber in Florida. He was 25 years old when he brutally attacked Mildred Matheny. Thus, only one thing made sense. Richard Lang was the true offender. Richard Curtis Lang was given a life sentence in prison by Circuit Court Judge Delia Weiss in response to the most serious charge of first-degree murder. Lang, who was 63, was found guilty. Lang's family told the judge they would file an appeal after he was found guilty. In court, his lawyer read aloud the letter. They believed the conviction to be at odds with their knowledge of Richard Lang. They claimed that the man in court was not the same person they knew and that the charges against him did not align with who he really was. The letter provided an alternative account of the man who was found guilty in 1985 of causing severe physical harm to Mildred Matheny, a 78-year-old woman, regarded as a devoted uncle, brother, father, and son. Richard Lang lived a respectable life, grounded in his Catholic beliefs. The judge was reminded in a letter by the great-niece of Mildred Matheny of the severe pain and agony Mildred had endured prior to her death. Mixon, one of the lawyers, read aloud a letter that Matheny's great-niece had written. It ran counter to Richard Lang's appeal for mercy. Mixon pleaded with the judges to remember Mildred Matheny's anguish and terror. Judge Weiss concurred that Mildred's death was brutal and horrifying. In addition to the previous life sentence for killing, Mixon also asked for a second life sentence for battery. Judge Weiss agreed to 15 years despite Scott Skier's request for 9. Mildred Methany's death resulted in Richard Curtis Lang receiving a life sentence. Right now, he's spending the rest of his life behind bars. With all of the details, characters, and events familiar to you, bringing your case to a close may seem simple. It is impossible to overstate the emotional toll and complexity that accompanied such a journey, though. For more than 36 years, Gary Metheny had been waiting impatiently for a call similar to the one he eventually got. At last, he found out that his elderly mother's terrible death had been attributed to someone. He expressed his feelings by saying, "I'd given up hope." He had experienced years of unpredictability. At the age of 88, he was ecstatic to hear of the arrest. The quiet North Shore town of Pupkia, Hawaii, discovered a sinister secret on December 7, 2017. That day, a terrible incident rocked the charming suburb. This is the tale of Thelma Boy Neville, a devoted 51-year-old teacher who had an ordinary life until she took a part-time job cleaning a vacation rental. She was unaware that the ordinary day she was living would become a nightmare that would alter the lives of those around her. The renters found her dead at a vacation rental on Keiki Road. The community was engulfed in a web of unsolved questions, fear, and a search for the truth as information came to light. How did a regular teacher named Thelma Boy Neville come to a terrifying end in a quiet Hawaiian town? What startling disclosures are in store? Was it murder or just an accident that claimed her life? Pupkia, a charming village located in the Kalawa district on Hawaii's North Shore, unavoidably influenced Thelma Boy Neville's life. The word Pupkia in Hawaiian refers to a white shell perfectly capturing its spotless surroundings. Pupkia is well known for having stunning beaches that draw surfers and beachgoers. This included beaches such as Sunset Beach and Waimea Bay. Sharks Cove and Three Tables are also excellent sites for diving and snorkeling. The town is quiet, but Thelma's life was brutally altered at Pup because she had to provide for her family, and it had a lasting impact on the community. Thelma Boy Neville was well known to the residents of Hawaii's North Shore as a devoted teacher and a devoted mother. On February 4, 1966, she was born in a small Brazilian town. Her curiosity and love of learning remained, defining characteristics of her personality throughout her life. Thelma started working as a teacher at Sunset Beach Elementary School. She wanted to help her children and others. She understood that education was important for developing young brains. Thelma believed that her ministry was education. Her colleagues respected her for her dedication to teaching children. Her classroom gradually supported and nurtured developing minds in a kind and supportive manner. According to her co-workers, Thelma was a committed educator who went above and beyond to support her students' success. Thelma's first concern was her family. She supported her family, even though teaching was her career, by working part-time as a cleaner for vacation rentals on the North Shore. This proved her dedication to her family and her unwavering work ethic. After she married Kevin Emery, Thelma had a daughter named Makarna who was very important to her. She had Makarna as a child, friend, and confidant. Their intimate bond revealed Thelma's unrestricted love and maternal disposition. Makarna looked to her mother for support and guidance. Her presence, generosity, and love for her family and students changed the town irrevocably. Sadly, she was unaware of the shocking and disastrous turn fate had in store for her. Beneath North Shore, Hawaii's picture-perfect exterior, lay a horrifying and unanticipated tragedy. Teacher Thelma Boy Neville was a hard worker. She relished the peace and quiet of North Shore. She had a second job cleaning vacation homes in the area to help support her family. She arrived at a holiday house on Keiki Road, an ordinary neighborhood that had grown infamous for its terror. This idyllic scene was upended in the most unexpected way, all without Thelma knowing. While Makona, her 8-year-old daughter, slept outside in the family car, Thelma had cleaning duties for the vacation rental. Inexplicable violence was experienced by Thelma Boy Neville in the vacation rental. When she got there, Stephen Brown and his girlfriend, Haley Dandaran, were breaking and entering the rental house. Thelma's life was rocked by an awful incident that transpired on a typical workday. She tried to fight off the intruders, but as the fight grew more intense, Thelma took a serious blow to the head. On the serene North Shore, there was an unexplained violent act. In the peace of the vacation home, Thelma fought for her life in a horrific battle before passing away. The violence was indicated by chilling blunt force injuries to her skull. She left behind a spooky pool of blood as a testament to the brutality that had claimed her life. Even there, the terror persisted. Her 8-year-old daughter, Makana, was oblivious to the darkness. She had always looked forward to her mother's return. Her peace was short-lived as the evil criminals, Haley Danderand and Stephen Brown, started focusing on Makana. In the vacation rental, she was restrained and placed under a gag, sending her into a nightmare that no child should ever go through. Her world of innocence and trust was shattered. The gorgeous Hawaiian light that had filled the car she was waiting in was replaced by the blackness of her kidnapper's hatred. Makana was deceived and cruelly restrained and silenced by Haley Danderand and Stephen Brown. They brutally informed the young girl that Thelma Boyneville, her mother, had been killed. Makana's innocence was cruelly shattered as her world fell apart. This horrible tale of violence and deceit featured another horrifying episode in which Makana was abducted and fed with cruel lies. Thelma Boyneville was killed by Stephen Brown and Haley Danderand, who also severely injured her. After the incident was reported, at around 3:20 p.m. local time, officers investigating at the vacation home on Keiki Road in North Shore, Hawaii found Thelma Boyneville's lifeless body. Thelma was the victim of a horrifying assassination. An extensive investigation to find justice was spurred by the case of Thelma Boyneville and the kidnapping of her daughter, Makana. That day, a distress call that was received by law enforcement, including the Honolulu Police Department, changed many lives. When police arrived at the vacation rental on Keiki Road, they discovered a horrible tragedy. Inside the rental, they discovered Thelma Boyneville dead. Blood stains and fight-related debris painted a bleak picture of what had occurred inside. An extensive examination of the crime scene preceded the investigation. Forensic experts who searched the vacation rental painstakingly recorded every piece of evidence. The main objective was to reconstruct Makana's kidnapping and Thelma's case. A key piece of evidence from the scene was the blunt force damage to Thelma's head. This graphic detail brought the severity of the crime to light. After searching the area for witnesses, investigators spoke to Makana. As she described that tragic day, professionals including child psychologists were called in to protect her mental health. Makana's story was written down in case it held any clues to the mysteries, her recollections of the perpetrators. Their actions and their horrific deceit strengthened the case. Thelma's brother-in-law, American big wave surfer Garrett McNamara, set the world record for the largest wave. McNamara was the first person to negotiate a Jaws barrel and ride a glacier wave. Because of his name and Guinness World Records, he had a sizable fan base on social media. After Surfer, Garrett McNamara made a passionate Facebook video and offered a sizable reward for the suspect's capture. Things took a turn for the better. In the video, McNamara, who claimed to be related to Thelma Boyneville's daughter, made a $100,000 offer to anyone with information about the horrific murder that occurred on Keiki Beach in North Shore, Hawaii. His fervent appeal became widely shared on social media. He encouraged others to come forward with information by offering a sizable prize. By signing this petition, you help bring attention to the need to solve the case and bring the offenders to justice. Numerous people submitted leads, tips, and information regarding the incident after McNamara's video went viral and increased public awareness. Law enforcement was greatly aided in locating and apprehending the offenders by this information. The justice process was initiated by law enforcement. In an attempt to apprehend the culprits as soon as possible, the Honolulu Police Department launched a comprehensive investigation. Important hints were discovered at the vacation home on Keiki Road, where the culprit was apprehended. Detectives investigating the crime scene methodically examined the vacation home for signs of the murderer. To build a case against the offender, they painstakingly gathered forensic evidence, including DNA fingerprints. The investigation proceeded and the puzzle pieces fell into place. Witnesses such as Makana, Thelma's daughter, assisted in reconstructing the incidents. The culprit was exposed by Makana's horrifying account of her mother's murder and captivity. The investigation was aided by kind people. growing media coverage and McNamara's offer of the hefty prize, which resulted in the capture of Stephen Brown and Haley Danderand, the murderers. One of the main suspects in the murder of Thelma Bointville was Stephen Brown. His involvement in the tragic burglary and his presence at the crime scene implicated him. Following forensic evidence, witness statements, and investigations, just 7 hours later, on December 8, 2017, Stephen Brown was taken into custody for justice. The community was rocked by the arrest once more, but this time it came with a promise to hold the perpetrators accountable and hope. As the investigation went on, Stephen Brown's testimony shed light on that very fateful day. Brown claimed that before going through an open window to enter the vacation property, he and Danderand consumed marijuana. Danderand told Thelma to lie down so they could bind her when she came in. Investigators had doubts about Brown's testimony. Thelma's injuries and his bloody clothes did not point to self-defense. Brown's terrifying story was at odds with McCarna's. Scott Bell, the deputy prosecutor, was confident that Thelma Boineville could only be subdued by Brown. McConaughey's statement that Brown told her they killed her mother was undermining the investigation that was conducted. A complex web of violence, betrayal, and sorrow in the peaceful North Shore. As the jigsaw pieces started to fit together, justice appeared to be just around the corner. The horrific murderer, Stephen Brown, had a violent past and a turbulent background. When he killed Thelma, 1994 born, Stephen Brown was 23 years old. His early legal issues presented a depressing picture of a young man on a terrible path. Given Brown's violent criminal past, concerns about his potential for aggression are warranted. Detectives looking into his background were suspicious of this path. Haley Danderand, Brown's girlfriend at the time of the crime, was an enigmatic 1997 born. At the time of the crime, she was 20 years old. Many were confused by Danderand's role in the horrific events of that day. Following a trial, Stephen Brown was found guilty of 2 kidnappings, murder, and burglary. His punishment was the first of the consequences of his actions. After the arrest, the legal procedures started. Utilizing witness accounts, evidence from the crime scene, and McConaughey's horrifying account, the prosecution assembled a compelling case. When the crime was revealed, the courtroom turned into a battle for justice and the truth. After a 6-year trial that depicted the grisly killings and the events of that terrible day, the jury made its decision. Following a heated courtroom, Stephen Brown was found guilty of assassination, kidnapping, and burglary. The North Shore community and Thelma Boineville's family experienced closure. Stephen Brown's conviction marked the start of his legal journey. Despite knowing he would probably live out the rest of his days behind bars, he accepted his fate. Justice was carried out. The atrocity would leave a scar on Thelma's family and the community. Following a 2-week trial that enthralled the nation and the North Shore, the courtroom was filled with heated anticipation. Following an extensive legal trial, a jury consisting of 12 members with diverse backgrounds rendered a verdict on Friday, January 20, 2023. The courtroom drama involving Stephen Brown, the primary suspect in Thelma Boineville's December 2017 murder, rocked Pup's peaceful community. Less than 30 minutes into the trial, the jury's verdict altered the case. Stephen Brown, who was found guilty of several charges, was recognized as having a significant part in the tragic events of that December day. In addition to Brown's killing conviction, his allegations included 2 kidnappings, 1 burglary, and a second-degree killing. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court was struck by the judgment. The prosecution methodically built its case, presenting testimony and supporting documentation that painted a horrifying picture of what transpired at the vacation house on Kiki Road. Deputy Prosecutor Scott Bell stated with conviction that Haley Danderand and Stephen Brown killed Thelma Boineville. According to the prosecution, Brown could physically restrain Thelma. While vehemently denying any involvement in the murder, the defense argued that Stephen Brown was responsible for the break-in and kidnapping. William Bagasol, Brown's court-appointed council member, emphasized in the tragedy the distinctions between Brown and his girlfriend Haley Danderand. Bagasol explained in a methodical manner that Haley had no blood and that she had tied Thelma up. Additionally, He didn't think that Brown and the weapons used to kill Thelma were linked by DNA. Courtrooms served as both emotional theaters and arenas for conflicting narratives. The town, shocked by the horrific murder of Thelma Boyneville, watched the trial and the outcome with bated breath. The North Shore neighborhood's patience was put to the test by the conviction and trial's length. After 2017 shocks, Thelma Boyneville and her family achieved a significant turning point in their quest for justice following Stephen Brown's conviction. The trial cleared the way for the trial of Haley Dandurand, the second suspect in the case, and provided closure to a terrified community. Haley Dandurand trial commenced in July 2023. After a month of deliberation, she was convicted of burglary, kidnapping, and murder. The jury sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The North Shore community exhaled with relief following the judgment, knowing that a trying chapter of their journey had come to an end. But the suffering of Thelma Boyneville and her daughter, Makana, will always serve as a reminder of the evil that can exist even in the best of circumstances. The North Shore neighborhood and Thelma Boyneville's family experienced closure following Stephen Brown and Haley Dandurand's trial. After years of pain, uncertainty, and unsettling memories of December 2017, justice was served. After losing their teacher and mother, the family took solace in the sentencing. The verdict upheld their unwavering pursuit of accountability and the truth. June Nicholas discovered her aunt, Lillian D. Chloe, who was 89 years old, dead on the bedroom floor of her yellow brick house at 1550 Northwest South Avenue in Pompano Beach, Florida on Saturday, April 29, 1994. Not a single person knew who had beaten, assaulted, and strangled her in broad daylight. This tragic tale would take investigators on an unexpected journey, using forensic analysis and DNA evidence, culminating in the revelation of a startling truth that would remain a secret for the next 28 years. With every passing moment, June and the rest of Lillian's family would be enmeshed in a web of sorrow and suffering over the insignificant question: who would want to hurt a harmless 89-year-old woman? The narrative of today transports us back 30 years to the brutal assassination of Lillian D. Chloe in 1994. Today's tale takes place in the charming city of Pompano Beach, Florida, which is located in Broward County. The name Pompano Beach comes from a once abundant species of fish that was found off the coast of the city's beaches, which have azure blue waters and soft golden sand. In the year 1994, Lillian D. Chloe, then 89, could still enjoy Pompano Beach after a youth well spent despite the area's high crime rate. In 1905, Lillian Dickler was born. Lillian committed her youth to serving others, particularly through her work as a teacher and nurse. All those who knew her cherished her for her kindness, patience, and caring nature, including her neighbors, co-workers, her patients, and students. June Nicholas, Lillian's niece, was among the many people who cherished her. Lillian assisted in raising June, her siblings, and her cousins when they were younger. Lillian moved to Pompano Beach, Florida to live out her twilight years in peace, with June taking care of her as she grew older and began to experience memory loss due to illnesses related to aging. Lillian Declos, who was 89 years old, was a shining example of a life well lived to everyone who knew her. Lillian retired to her yellow brick home at 1550 Northwest 7th Avenue, Pompano Beach, after years of serving her community as a teacher and nurse. She lived a fairly normal life there by herself until violence broke through the window of her bedroom and disturbed her peace. For Lillian Declos, Saturday, April 29th, 1994 was just like any other. Expecting a visit from her niece, June, later that evening, she relaxed throughout the day in her pink and white checkered nightgown. As Lillian grew older, took on the role of caregiver, visiting her regularly to see how she was doing and to offer assistance with housework, medication reminders, or just to keep her company. That fateful day, June showed up at Lillian's house at around 6 o'clock to see how she was doing and to drop off some groceries that she had gotten for her. She went into the living room and saw that Lillian was not there. June then yelled out the aunt's name to find out her location, but she got no response. June looked in Lillian's usual sleeping quarters, the first bedroom, but she was nowhere to be found. June followed the hallway and peered into the bedroom on the right. She became a little startled. Her Aunt Lillian was lying on the floor there, appearing to be deceased. June let out a cry and hurried back up the hallway to dial 911. When June's 911 call came in, 2 Pompano Beach Police Department officers responded, their minds buzzing with questions. An 89-year-old woman being killed in her own home was not a story you heard very often. Thus, it appeared to be an odd call. When the officers got to 1550 Northwest 7th Avenue, they were able to confirm Lillian's death. Lillian was found lying on the floor next to a floor lamp that had fallen over and a phone that had its cord pulled out. She was covered in bruises and cuts that suggested she had been beaten. Towels and other clothing items stained with blood were strewn all over the room. In the room where Lillian's body was discovered, the officers also observed a broken window, which is probably where Lillian's attackers had entered. The residence had been pillaged. There had obviously been a violent struggle as Lillian fought for her life, judging by the several broken pieces of furniture scattered throughout the room. The shocking state of Lillian's body gave the impression that it was a crime of passion at first. Lillian's body was covered in contusions. She had fractures to her wrist, nose, and ribs. In addition, there were bruises surrounding her genitalia, indicating that she had been assaulted prior to her demise. She had also been strangled, as evidenced by the bruises on her neck. After Lillian's autopsy, the Broward Medical Examiner's office determined that she had died from asphyxiation and a blow to the head. The attacker strangled Lillian with the telephone that had the cord pulled out, which was discovered next to her body. But there was no sign that Lillian's assailant had targeted her in particular. So it's likely that the crime was not motivated by passion. Lillian had no enemies because she was generally well-liked in her community. Lieutenant Earl Fluellen of the Pompano Beach Police Department stated that the overall condition of the house and the crime scene suggested that the case was probably one of a burglary gone wrong. However, that was incomprehensible to Lillian's relatives, who were aware that she had lived alone and had no wealth worthy of losing her life. June remembered that at the time of the incident, Lillian had no more than $50 at the house. A gold wedding band was the only item that seemed missing after the house was searched. The last time the neighbors saw Lillian was when she went to buy a newspaper at around 6:50 a.m. that morning. But police officers interviewed them after gathering evidence from the crime scene to see if they had heard anything connected to Lillian's murder. Despite the fact that the murder happened in broad daylight, she appeared hale and hearty that morning, and nobody could remember seeing anything suspicious. Detectives had compiled a list of possible suspects in Lillian's murder within a few days, but not enough to warrant an arrest. In an effort to encourage witnesses to try and recall anything they may have heard or seen that could aid in the investigation, the police offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to the murderer of Lillian's identification. Sandra King, a spokeswoman for the Pompano Beach Police, also informed the media that the police were searching for anyone with information regarding the crime or the man who committed it. Sandra King stated in an interview with The Sun, "This point, we are urging anyone who saw anything to call us, with the blood of a defenseless 89-year-old woman in their hands. Some sort of human monster is rampant." However, despite the initial weeks of investigation and encouraging progress, all leads quickly dried up and the case became cold. June Nicholas, meanwhile, was in mourning over the passing of her cherished Aunt Lillian. It was so difficult for her to move on without her aunt and without knowing what had happened or who had hurt her in such a way. June was affected by her aunt's demise that she had to take a full year off of work. She was in too much pain to care for her children for a few months, so she had to ask someone else to watch them while she grieved. No matter how hard she tried, she was unable to shake the picture of Lillian lying motionless on the floor of her home. To make matters worse, the case was abandoned, extinguishing any possibility of learning the truth about Lillian's true fate. The Lillian Decloe case was shelved and forgotten for the following 10 years, during which time there were no new developments. However, by 1999, Pompano Beach was receiving law enforcement services from the Broward Sheriff's Office. Taking control of every cold case in Pompano Beach was part of this. The 1994 murder of Lillian D. Clow was one of the cold cases that the detectives from the Broward Sheriff's Office reopened by 2004. The investigation was led by Broward Sheriff's Office Detective David Towsley. Re-examined evidence taken from the crime scene nearly 30 years prior and looked through old case files' DNA databases with the assistance of other detectives in the unit. The pink and white checkered nightgown Lillian was wearing the day she was killed was one piece of evidence that really stuck out. The nightgown contained bodily fluids from the male attacker, which they found when they sent it to the lab for additional testing. This information was possibly the most important piece of evidence in cracking the case. The police used the fluid sample from the nightgown to create a genetic profile, which they then entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, but they were unable to find a match. Once more, a potentially fruitful lead had vanished and the case was abandoned. To allow Lillian Declo's family to move on and find closure, Detective Towsley was adamant about wrapping up the case. Detective Towsley's perseverance allowed him to revisit the case in 2019 under the Broward Sheriff's Office's recently established cold case unit, even though it took an additional 15 years. According to Jennifer Parker, the criminalist from the Broward Sheriff's Office who was in charge of doing the DNA analysis of the evidence in the case, it didn't seem like anything would come of reopening the Declo case. However, Towsley thought he could identify the person who left their bodily fluid on Lillian's nightgown because of advances in DNA testing technology. In 2021, the Broward County Crime Lab was able to obtain a more comprehensive DNA profile thanks to this new technology analysis. In order to perform a familial search of its offender database, Detective Towsley and his team requested that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement use the DNA profile. In other words, they compared the DNA profile to the database of individuals who had been arrested and registered as offenders. Using this method, the DNA profile is compared to potential first-order relatives, such as a child, father, or sibling in the database. There was a match found by the search. The crime scene's DNA and the DNA of a known offender in the system were remarkably similar. The perpetrator was identified as the son of the man whose DNA was discovered on Lillian Declo's dress the day she was killed. Johnny Matt Brown was the name of this man. Johnny Matt Brown was 40 years old when Lillian Declo was murdered, having been born in 1954. He was a veteran of the Vietnam War and experienced PTSD. For Johnny, life after the military was not pleasant. He turned to drug use as a coping mechanism for his PTSD, which ultimately led to drug addiction. He struggled to find stable employment for a while due to his addiction and mental health problems. Johnny also ended up on the streets. Johnny was never thought of as a suspect in this case or any other crime. When investigators first started looking into Lillian's death, he was completely unnoticed. But when Johnny's DNA profile was matched by the police, it became increasingly clear that Johnny was most likely the person who had attacked Lillian on that fateful day. Additionally, police uncovered some vital information. Although Johnny lived a few miles away from Lillian in the early 1990s and early 1994, detectives were unable to apprehend Johnny for questioning because he had passed away. At the age of 56, he passed away from natural causes in 2010. Johnny was laid to rest in the South Florida National Cemetery in Lake Worth, Florida. In August 2022, the request of the Broward Sheriff's Office detectives to exhume Johnny's remains for analysis was granted by a judge. The detectives collaborated with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, the Palm Beach Medical Examiner's Office, and her forensic anthropologist, who dug up the remains and performed DNA testing on them. In order to obtain the most accurate result possible, the experts tested samples taken from Johnny's body in the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab. Jennifer Parker, the criminalist in charge of the office, compared the results to the pre-existing DNA profile. Parker extracted a sample of Johnny's rib bone's bone marrow for analysis. The test produced a match between the sample discovered at the crime scene and the known DNA profile. According to the Broward Sheriff's Office, the DNA results indicated that the DNA from the crime scene was 66.8 trillion times more likely to belong to Johnny than to anyone else. With this solid proof, there was no question that Johnny Mack Brown was the murderer in Lillian Declo's case. However, that did not adequately explain Johnny's motive. The most plausible explanation for the entire incident appeared to be the previous assumption that it was just a case of burglary gone bad. Gregory Toney, the sheriff for Broward County, stated in a press conference that it was probably an opportunity crime. The sheriff said he lived close by, only a few houses down. He broke into the house when he fell on hard times, became homeless, and developed a drug habit. He might not have realized she was by herself there. She was 89 though. She appeared to be living alone because everything seemed to have been taken out of the house and all the drawers were open. The Broward State Attorney's Office was shown all of the evidence that the police had gathered up to this point. After looking over the case, the prosecutors there came to the conclusion that Johnny Mac Brown had something to do with Lillian Decloe's death. The matter was resolved. While 28 years may seem like a long time to wait for justice, Sheriff Tony feels that justice is eternal. He continued, "So long as we are responsible for investigating these cases, we are going to continue to push for the necessary manpower, an effort to make sure that we can bring closure to so many families who have been waiting for decades time and time again in the hope that they get some resolution." The family of Lillian Decloe prayed for answers to the enigmatic circumstances surrounding their loved one's death for 28 years. They can now start moving on since they have at last found the answers they were looking for. June Nicholas, who discovered Leon's frigid corpse years prior, expresses her gratitude to the Broward Sheriff's Office for their commitment and for learning the truth about her aunt's passing. She thinks her aunt can now at last sleep in peace. "I'm sure she can sleep soundly wherever she is. We can move on. We can die peacefully because we are certain that her murder has been solved. Even though we know for sure who killed Lillian Decloe by the time the story ends, there are still some unanswered questions that nag at us from an unknowable past. What motivated Johnny Mac Brown to act in that way? In the years that followed, did he feel bad about it? Was it too long for the investigators to identify the true murderer? Is it accurate to state that justice was done in this instance?" 25-year-old Nadine Major lived with her husband Mark and their infant son Dan in an apartment in Willoughby, Ohio in 1980. When Mark returned home from work on January 11, 1980, he found Nadine's body in their dining room. She had been stabbed more than 40 times. Just a few feet from her body was their son, still in his living room playpen. Fortunately, he was unharmed. During the initial investigation, Willoughby police determined that Nadine's life was taken sometime between 1:15 p.m. and 4:45 p.m. There were no signs of forced entry, nor evidence that she had been assaulted. Nothing seemed to be missing from the home except the weapon, which came from Nadine's kitchen. The person who took her life did, however, leave something behind. His blood was found on Nadine's shirt. A significant amount of blood belonging to an unknown male was located on Nadine's shirt, said police. Some of the suspect's blood on Nadine's shirt was in the form of perpendicular drops, which indicated that the suspect was standing on top of Nadine while he was bleeding. A neighbor of Nadine noticed a canary yellow Dodge Dart parked in the rear of their apartment complex around the time her life was taken. It's not a car that belonged to anyone living in the complex. Investigators followed up on the lead, but unfortunately it did not lead anywhere and the case went cold. Police received new information based on the DNA found on Nadine's clothing after establishing a partnership with the Lake County Crime Lab, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. They later teamed up with Lake County Prosecutor's Office and Parabon Nanolabs to build a family tree from the DNA profile, ultimately leading them to Stephen Joseph Simcak through the use of genetic genealogy. Investigators compared the male DNA from blood on Nadine's shirt to one of Simcak's biological children, and found a match. People who knew Simcak then confirmed he had owned a canary yellow Dodge Dart back in 1980. Authorities then looked into Simcak's work record from his 37-year career at Lincoln Electric Company in Euclid, Ohio, which is less than 10 miles from Willoughby. In 1980, Simcak only missed one day of work, the day Nadine's life was taken. Simcak was due in for a second shift that day and called in sick. Police also learned that, at the time, Simcak had other jobs, delivering flowers for Wycliffe Floral and working with V. Tintonio's winery in Wycliffe, just a few miles southwest of both his and Needing's home. Simcak retired in 2002 and moved to Bemis Point, New York, about 60 miles southwest of Buffalo, according to police. He passed away at 79 in 2018, leaving behind a wife, 3 biological children, and 2 stepchildren. Nadine's husband, Mark Major, had this to say at a press conference held by police. He stole Nadine from her family and friends. Most of all, he stole Nadine from me and my son. How could he get up every day and look himself in the mirror, knowing what he did? She did not deserve this, he continued. If there's a place in hell, I know he's in it, and I hope he rots there. Mark continued that Nadine did not know Simcak, leaving loved ones and investigators puzzled about a possible motive. Nadine's son, Dan, had this to say at the press conference: I am angry that Stephen passed away as a free and carefree citizen before he could be identified as well as caught, and in turn given the ability for questions to be asked and justice to be served. 18-year-old Barbara Jean Jepson and her husband Joe Jepson lived in Van Nuys, California in January 1956. The couple got married the previous year. Barbara was 4 months pregnant. Joe worked for the National Air Guard. On January 31, 1956, Joe went to work early in the morning. Barbara was last seen shopping at 12:30 p.m. When Joe returned home, he found Barbara's body in their bed. She had been fatally stabbed. After the gruesome discovery, Joe first covered up his wife with a blanket and then called police. Detectives who responded to the Jepson house that day found several items of evidence, such as green army jacket with blood and hair follicles in the garage. One witness told police that a person was seen leaving the area that day wearing a green jacket. Another talked about seeing a man with big hands and big knuckles. Unfortunately, investigators back then didn't know how great DNA would eventually be at solving cold cases. So items such as the pillowcases, bed sheets, and a bloody rag found in the sink at the Jepson home were not collected. At the time, detectives believed that what happened to Barbara was linked to a series of assaults in the same area. They tracked down every man who's committed similar crimes in the area to question them. Unfortunately, this did not lead anywhere and the case went cold. In 2019, Los Angeles Police Detective Rachel Evans took another look at Barbara's case. It was the very first case she was assigned to after joining the cold case unit. On her first day, a veteran detective handed her the case file and said good luck. By the time she started working on it, hundreds of detectives already combed through it over the past 60 years. It took Evans a week to read through the entire case file. Then she read it a second time and started taking notes. The third time she read through the file, she started noticing a lot of things. One of the things she picked up on was that there was no forced entry at the Jepsons' home. It seemed to Evans that Barbara knew the person who attacked her. She also noticed that no valuables were taken and nothing was out of place. As Evans reviewed the case, it wasn't long before she started focusing on one man. A man from Utah by the name of Mont R. Mears. Mears was born on May 24, 1911 in Mount Pleasant, Utah. In 1931, he married Cleo Ream and the couple had one son and one daughter. They were later divorced and Mears married another woman, Bernice, in the San Fernando Valley. That marriage also ended in divorce in 1945, with Bernice citing cruelty. By then, Mears was an avid gambler, violent to animals, a womanizer, and a raging alcoholic. He was also the suspect in many assault cases. By 1948, he moved in with a woman named Fern Spiva in San Fernando Valley and stayed with her for 6 years. At the time Mears and Spiva began living together, she had a 10-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. That daughter is Barbara. Evans believed that Mears abused her along the way because that was kind of his modus operandi. He would marry young women who had young girls and he would then go on to abuse them. In 1955, when Barbara married Joe, Mears married his fourth wife. This woman also had a young daughter. In 1960, 15-year-old Mary and Pedrota, who had a horse stable next to Mears's and often rode horses with him, was found fatally stabbed. Then, in 1962, Mears married his fifth wife, Ina. She too had a young daughter. In 1964, Mont Mears was arrested and accused of abusing a 14-year-old girl. Information on that case was hard for Evans to collect because the case file had been destroyed. Although it is clear that was involved in many crimes, this was the only victim for which he was arrested. Also, in 1964, while waiting for the trial, Mears showed up at hospital with a gunshot wound. He claimed that it was an accidental shooting. Who shot Mers and why was never determined. By 1965, all of Mers's crimes were coming to a head. He was given a polygraph test by police who asked him about what happened to Barbara Jepson. He denied even knowing her. Investigators knew that he was at her funeral and that he knew her since she was 10 because he was married to her mom for some time. The polygraph test results concluded that Mers had definite guilty knowledge regarding the fate of Barbara. On August 15, 1965, while Mers was out of jail and with numerous questions looming about what else he had been involved with, his wife Ina found underwear from a young girl in a drawer in their house. She confronted Mers about whether he had also been abusing that girl. The confrontation was apparently the last straw as Mers proceeded to grab a gun from inside the house. He chased Ina into the street where he fatally shot her. He then went back inside the house and took his own life. Recently, a former stepdaughter of Mers called the police to tell him about 15-year-old Mary and Perderota, the girl who often rode horses with Mers and who was stabbed 9 times. The stepdaughter told police that she was 10 years old at the time. She remembers that on the day that Marion lost her life, Mers came into the house with a bloody knife and blood on his hands and clothing. The stepdaughter waited until he and his entire family were no longer alive until she told police. That's how scared she was. She told police that she still had nightmares of him every night. Evans would soon learn that Mers had a pattern of never leaving his victims alone, even after he remarried or when his stepdaughters grew up and moved out of the house. According to Evans' research, 5 women were seen at Mers's funeral wearing black and crying. Evans said so he was kind of a womanizer. He had all these women that he connected with and kind of kept. There's a lot of stories around him with these young girls that were abused by him. Until the day Barbara's mom passed away, even though they were no longer married, Mers would still visit her. That's why Evans believes on the day that Barbara's life was taken, Mers showed up at her residence and did not need to break into her house. As you'll remember, one of the witnesses saw a man wearing a green jacket with big hands and big knuckles. Big hands and big knuckles were something the Mers family were known for. A drawing of the person who was believed to have committed the assaults in the area showed a man who wore a plaid shirt. Evans said that Mers was also known to always wear a plaid shirt. He was wearing one in his mugshot taken in his 1964 arrest. Most of his victims had their hands bound during their attacks. The same was the case with Barbara. Despite the lack of DNA evidence that still exists today from the crime scene, Evans attempted to use today's DNA technology to help solve the case. After some extensive research, Evans was able to track down Mers's relatives still living in Utah in 2019, including his children. Evans gives big kudos to Draper Police and Unified Police for assisting her investigation. In September 2019, a search warrant for DNA was served to Mers's 87-year-old son. Mers's son passed away just 2 weeks after the DNA was collected. Unfortunately, it was ultimately determined there was not enough DNA from the crime scene to compare with the DNA collected from Mers's son. Evans said now that police have it preserved. They will revisit the case about every 5 years to see if advances in DNA technology get to the point so that the old DNA can finally be tested and compared to familial DNA from Mers. Even though the DNA from the crime scene is too weak to prove 100% it was Mers, investigators believe now in 2022 they have more than enough evidence against Mers that if he were still alive, he would be found guilty of taking Barbara's life. Investigators have also been able to clear other suspects using the DNA. One of these people was Barbara's husband, Joe. Even though he was cleared by the police in the initial investigation, he lived the rest of his life with the stigma surrounding him. Some members of the community questioned his innocence since he was the one who found his wife's body. Joe remarried and had 2 sons. Although the boys always believed their father was innocent, Evans said it was especially satisfying to be able to call them earlier this year and tell them that their father had conclusively been cleared. On the other side, Evans said Mers's grandchildren were upset when she told them what kind of person their grandfather really was. They had been told that he had passed away in a car accident. The grandchildren took the pictures they had of him out of their homes and threw it away. To solve Barbara's case, Evans said she took a page from the detectives of the 1950s, pounding the pavement and turning over rocks looking for clues. But Evans also has her own gift for striking up conversations with people. People have a lot of info to share, so you sit back and listen to them, she said. In addition to having to prove herself to the veteran detectives, Evans admits she felt solving the case was something she had to do for Barbara Jepson's family so that they could finally have some peace about what happened. She admits that at times she felt guided as she worked to solve the 6 decades-old cold case. I think people are crying from the dust for justice. Their families need it. I know it's not my family, but there's somebody who's still crying over this. You had a husband that passed away that people always had suspicion about. So for me, you get closure for the families to know that their dad was good or their mom was great. You know you have some peace for them because they lived all these years with no peace. So for me and others I work with, we do this so the families can have rest. I can't bring them back, but the families can have rest. On the morning of July 15, 1982, gravedigger George Keyes discovered the body of a Caucasian woman in the rear of the Cedar Ridge Cemetery in Blairstown, New Jersey. The body was found lying on its back just over a steep bank that leads to a creek below. The victim's face had been beaten beyond recognition with an undetermined object. The medical examiner estimated that she was in her late teens or early 20s. Examination indicated that the girl had attempted to fight back, or defended from her attacker, as trauma to her hands and arms was observed. The body was clad in a red short-sleeve shirt and a skirt. After seeing images of the girl's clothing in a newspaper, a witness named Anne-Marie Latimer told officials that she remembered seeing a girl wearing the same clothing as the victim, purchasing cigarettes on July 13, 1982, just 2 days before her body was found. Latimer stated that she was shopping with her daughter at a supermarket across from the cemetery and observed. She was able to describe the victim's clothing. The shirt and skirt themselves were traced to a manufacturer in the Midwestern United States. Some people also said that they bought similar clothes at a store in Long Island, New York. The victim was buried on January 22, 1983, after she had remained unidentified for over 5 months. Since no one knew her identity, she was named Princess Doe. Donated funds were used to pay for her coffin and headstone. The headstone was engraved with the text, "Princess Doe, missing from home, remembered by all." This is the first reconstruction made of Princess Doe, but did not lead to anything useful, unfortunately. For many years, Princess Doe was thought to be Diane Janice Dye. She was a missing teenager from San Jose, California, who vanished on July 30, 1979. This theory was supported by several law enforcement officials in the state of New Jersey. They went as far as to hold a press conference identifying Diane Dye as Princess Doe. In 2003, Princess Doe's DNA was compared with a sample of Diane's mother, Patricia. It was then conclusively determined that Princess Doe was not Diane Dye. In 1999, a woman named Donna Kenlaw was arrested in California for attempting to commit welfare fraud. When questioned by investigators, Donna decided to reveal that her husband, Arthur Kenlaw, is responsible for taking the lives of many women. Donna said that she was at the cemetery when Arthur took Princess Doe's life in July of 1982. Donna did not give any detailed information, and since Princess Doe had not been identified, it was difficult to prove that she was telling the truth and that Arthur was responsible. Arthur was, however, found guilty on a lot of other crimes. Investigators did get Donna to tell a forensic artist what the victim looked like. This is the sketch that was then made. One theory was submitted that Princess Doe may have been a runaway and could have been an individual using false names while employed at a hotel in Ocean City, Maryland. In 2012, the case was looked into again. A new composite sketch was made depicting her as a blonde, not brunette, like in the last sketch. Also, in 2012, a sample of her hair and tooth were examined through an isotope analysis and indicated that the victim was most likely born in the United States. The sample of her hair indicated that she had lived at least 7 to 10 months in the Midwestern or Northeastern United States. The tooth sample indicated that she could possibly be from Arizona. It was also believed that the victim spent a long period of time in Long Island, New York. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted in 2012 in hopes to generate new information. The same year, the most recent reconstruction was broadcast on CNN. Additional composites of Princess Doe were made by Carl Koppelman that illustrated her clothing. In 2021, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children partnered with investigators and Estrella Forensics to help identify Princess Doe. On June 18, 2021, investigators received the news that Estrella Forensics agreed to extract DNA and construct a DNA profile. On February 10, 2022, Estrella Forensics relayed to investigators that the creation of a DNA data file was successful. The results were then sent to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's consulting genealogists from Innovative Forensic Investigations. The managing officer was Jennifer Moore, who agreed to perform unlimited genealogy free of charge. On February 22, 2022, Innovative Forensics announced to investigators that they had a candidate for Princess Doe. Investigators then went to West Babylon, New York, where they met with Robert Alignac Jr. They believed he was the brother of Princess Doe. They also collected a DNA sample from Princess Doe's sister, which mitotyping technology used to build a mitochondrial DNA profile. The Union County Prosecutor's Office Forensic Laboratory assisted by creating an STR-DNA profile through the victim's sister's DNA sample. Mitotyping technology then sent the DNA profile to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. On April 29, 2022, the center identified Princess Doe as Dawn Olenek. She was formally announced on July 15, 2022, the 40th anniversary of her discovery. Her brother Robert said that Dawn left their home at her mother's request and was never seen or heard from again. Arthur Kinlaw has been interviewed again, and he confessed. Kinlaw remains imprisoned at the Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York. Investigators are now looking to piece together Dawn's movements in the time leading up to her demise. Dawn Rita Alignac was just 17 years old when her life was taken. 19-year-old Lindy Sue Beechler lived in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania in 1975. She had just recently got married. At about 8:45 p.m. on December 5, 1975, Lindy's aunt and uncle stopped by her apartment to exchange recipes. Instead, they found a horrific scene. There was blood on the front door, the entranceway wall, and on the carpet. They found Lindy's body on the living room floor. She had been stabbed 19 times with 2 different knives and assaulted. Investigators collected all forensic evidence they could at the crime scene. There were no signs of forced entry. Witnesses also didn't hear or see anything strange. In 1997, as DNA advanced, detectives with the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office submitted Lindy's underwear for DNA analysis. The lab found male DNA on it and could then create a DNA profile of the suspect. Recently, in 2019, investigators teamed up with C.C. Moore, who is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon created a composite sketch of the suspect based on the DNA evidence they had. In 2020, C.C. used DNA to build a family tree of the suspect. She found that he had deep roots in the local Lancaster community. She also found that the family tree of this unknown suspect contained many recent immigrant families from the tiny town of Gasparina, Italy. Finally, the search was narrowed down to 68-year-old David Sinopoli. Investigators learned that Sinopoli lived in the same apartment complex as Lindy. To ensure that it was his DNA that was left at the crime scene, authorities began surveilling Sinopoli, who didn't go out much in public. On February 11, 2022, investigators were able to obtain Sinopoli's DNA from a coffee cup he drank from and threw in the garbage at the airport. DNA found on Sinopoli's coffee cup was compared to DNA identified from the male DNA on Lindy's underwear. In June, investigators learned that the 2 spots of blood found on Lindy's pantyhose was consistent with the DNA profile obtained from her underwear. Detectives had long believed that the suspect had cut himself during the attack. Sinopoli is being held in Lancaster County Prison without bail. Investigators do not believe Sinopoli and Lindy knew each other. It was just a crime of opportunity. 30-year-old Patricia Stichler lived in Sylvania, Ohio with her 3 daughters in 1985. She was divorced and worked for more than 7 years with the 21st Century Health Spots. Patricia's body was found by her 11-year-old daughter in the early morning hours of January 2, 1985. Someone had entered their home and slashed her throat while she slept. Patricia's 3 daughters were sleeping in their beds down the hall when the crime occurred. A window in the home had been left open, though it was unclear whether it was opened by Patricia or someone else. Investigators said that there were no signs of forced entry. Fortunately, there was a DNA sample from the crime scene that belonged to an unknown male. In 1985, authorities were unable to identify a suspect, despite a thorough investigation. 2 new detectives were assigned to the case in 1998, but once again, it remained unsolved, even with the help of the Ohio Bureau of Investigation. The DNA profile became the focus of the investigation. Police enlisted the help of multiple agencies, including the Ohio BCI Forensic Lab and Lucas County Prosecutor's Office. They also established a new partnership with Advanced DNA Forensic Genealogy. Using genetic genealogy, experts determined the DNA belonged to Michael Mellis, whom investigators later determined was less than 100 feet from Patricia's home on the night her life was taken. He was 17 years old at the time and in high school. He lived on the same street as Patricia. His residence was across the street and just 6 houses away. Police say Mellis was not acquainted with Patricia or her family and would not have had any reason to be inside the victim's home. Mellis kicked the bucket before he could face prosecution. He joined the U.S. Army after graduating high school and lost his life in a single-vehicle car accident in 1989 while stationed in North Carolina. For Patricia's surviving daughters, who vowed to see their mother's case solved, questions remained. How did he get into their home? Did he see them? Why didn't he take their lives? Kristen Kelly, one of the daughters, said, "Help us understand the unknowns. Help her children end their suffering because it's not fair to any of us." 21-year-old Heather and Wilms lived in an apartment in Leon Valley, Texas in 2005. On February 22nd, Heather's friends got concerned when they could not reach her. The friends entered her apartment through a sliding glass door, and everyone's worst fears were realized as they found Heather's body in her bedroom. Heather's hands had been severed. Her clothes were burned in an apparent effort to conceal evidence. It was also determined that she had been assaulted. Neighbors of Heather's told police they heard her arguing with a man the previous day. They described shuffling sounds and then silence at 5 a.m. in the morning. Investigators questioned a lot of people close to Heather. One of those people was Jose Baldemiro Flores. He went to high school with her and stayed in touch afterwards. Flores was also one of the last to see her alive. Flores denied any involvement, and the DNA collected from Heather's body that belonged to the suspect was not strong enough to match to anyone. 6 years later, in 2011, 30-year-old Esmeralda Herrera's life was taken in a similar fashion to Heather's. She lived in San Antonio, Texas. Her body was found tied to her bed on March 2nd. She had been bludgeoned and strangled. Another fire had been set in an attempt to conceal evidence. This time, set in multiple places and large enough that firefighters arrived to put down the blaze. A month after Esmeralda's life was taken, Jose Flores was arrested in connection with her case. The charges against him were dropped a month later. A request to further investigate the case was denied. In 2015, then District Attorney Nico LaHood decided to take another look. Then, in December 2016, Flores was again arrested. This time he was charged with taking the lives of Heather and Esmeralda. DNA linked him to both cases. According to San Antonio officials, the pandemic slowed down the pace of court proceedings considerably. In early 2022, District Judge Melissa Skinner decided that all sides had waited long enough. But then, on the eve of jury selection for the trial, Flores took responsibility. The 41-year-old Flores was then sentenced to 3 separate life sentences. Heather's mother, Donna Ellis, had this to say during a victim impact statement, read during the sentencing. "I forgive you. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.